informal norms that we call the HXA way that guide what we do. And I just want to share them with you because they'll be the governing norms, in ideal at least, of our conversation today, as they are at every HXA event. So make your case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, please be intellectually humble, not an easy virtue for academics. Be constructive, look for the good in what people say. And of course, be yourself. Saying what you think is always powerful and helpful to us. Next slide. If you work in academia as a professor, administrator, or if you're a student, this is a call to action to you. Please consider joining HXA. Check out our website, subscribe to our email. We're a building organization, always looking for new members. Our members who join shape who we are. So if you're interested in these topics and want to help us grow to become a better version of ourselves at HXA, we welcome you. So please consider joining us. I'm going to go to the main. Okay, thanks. So our main event today. We're going to be talking about diversity statements. We have two really important speakers who are going to be bringing their different viewpoints to us on this topic. First, we have Randall Kennedy from Harvard Law School. Randall is the Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. We're also joined by Brian Soucek. Brian is a professor of law and the Chancellor's Fellow at UC Davis School of Law. He also recently chaired the University of California's system-wide Committee on Academic Freedom. I'm going to invite each of our speakers to speak for 10 minutes or so. Some may do less, some may do slightly more. They've told me in advance, but about 10 minutes each. Then we'll have some discussion between Professor Soucek and Kennedy. And then we'll also, of course, have discussion with all of you. I wanted just to take a moment before I turn it over to our speakers, just to make a few very brief points. It seems to me that there are three sets of issues that are separate but connected, and they often work together when we think about these questions about diversity statements. So I just want to mention these three buckets so we can try to keep them separate to some degree, or at least when we start to connect them, at least be aware that we're connecting them. First, there's a question about what is the appropriate goal or mission for a university? Most people, I think, would say it's the search for knowledge. At HXA, we say that the university is a community of imperfect learners who come together with humility and charity, ideally, to search for knowledge together. The big story of the past 50 years in the academy is the increase in racial and ethnic diversity. For example, this year in the Ivy League, some 54% of students identify as being part of a racial or ethnic minority. The Ivy League faculty numbers are a bit harder to get, but it's around 17%. So the first bucket of questions is something like, should managing or welcoming diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, be part of the university's mission? Second, there's an important set of questions about what's legally or constitutionally allowed. With few exceptions, state actors cannot base hiring decisions on a candidate's political viewpoint. Can or do diversity statements requirements pass legal muster? So it's a set of legal questions. And then third, certainly important too, what is an effective means to a desired ends? For example, does a candidate's stated commitment to inclusion, whether it's sincere or whether it's not sincere, does it actually result in a more inclusive campus? What kinds of evidence will we look for if we're trying to ascertain that answer to that question? And even if it does create a more inclusive campus, are there other costs that we should be thinking about? The other big story, perhaps, in the university for the past 50 years, along with the increasing racial ethnic diversity, is a decline of viewpoint diversity on an ideological dimension. In 1969, the ratio of professors who leant left versus those who leaned right was about 2 to 1. By 1999, it was about 5 to 1. Currently, nationally, it's about 12 to 1. One recent study showed that among junior faculty, it's 49 to 1. If we think about the wider missions of the university, and we think that it's appropriate to pursue diversity and it's legally allowed to pursue it in these ways, are there costs on that side that should be considered? If we think the university is a knowledge seeker, how does this question fit into those other questions? So 3 big buckets: what we ought to do, what we're legally allowed to do, and maybe what's effective. With that, I'm going to turn it over. Professor Kennedy, I think I'll have you go first if you don't mind.
Sure.
You have the floor for 10 minutes or less or more as you like.
Very good. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure.
I'm against mandatory diversity statements. I think that they ought to be abandoned. I think they ought to be abandoned immediately. Why? I'm against them because I don't think that scholars should be subjected to pledges of allegiance or loyalty tests that attempt to monitor and control not just their conduct, but their inner beliefs. And ultimately, that's what's going on with these mandatory diversity statements. You're being asked to signal that you're on board with the DEI project. That is really what's going on. It's a demand to signal that you're on board with the DEI project. And not only that, but it's a demand that you express your obedience in a certain way. And it seems to me that for our institutions, public or private, that is not a good way to run a university. Now, there has long been, and it's probably inevitable that there will be some sort of informal ideological vetting in various domains, history, anthropology, political science, economics, whatever. What's so striking about the current DEI mandatory requirement is the bureaucratization, the formalization of this ideological control. And it's not just ideological control, in the discipline, but it's ideological control that has institutional authority behind it and that is imposed from on high. So that's my central claim. Secondarily, I'm against the mandatory diversity statements because it has become such a counterproductive enterprise for diversity, inclusion, and belonging. It has become a self-destructive gesture on the part of the DEI bureaucracy. There is no aspect of the whole DEI apparatus that causes more resentment than what we're talking about today. And we're seeing the effects. As we speak, there are a number of states that are mandating the abolition of the whole DEI apparatus. Outside of those states, there are hundreds, probably thousands, maybe tens of thousands of academics who are in rebellion against the whole DEI enterprise because of this. And I'm a person who is very sympathetic to what I think is driving the DEI enterprise. The DEI enterprise did not just fall from the sky. It arose because of a real need. What was the real need? The real need was to turn the page on a history of exclusion at our institutions of higher education. Sometimes there were, the racial exclusion, gender exclusion, other sorts of exclusion. And there was an effort to repudiate that and to draw into higher education people who had previously been excluded. That was a good thing. That ought to continue, but that will not continue in a good way under this DEI mandatory statement, which is coercive and that actually just turns people against it. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Shakespeare makes Polonius say that brevity is the very soul of wit. You gave back 5 minutes of your 10, so thanks for that. Brian, I'm sure I'll have a Shakespearean response to you, but I'll turn the floor now to you for 10 minutes or so.
Okay, let's see if I can match Professor brevity here. I completely agree with Professor Kennedy that if there are statements out there that are requiring pledges of allegiance from faculty that are imposed on high by administrators and bureaucrats, and that are counterproductive to the goal of advancing diversity and inclusion on campus, then I'm completely against them. I think where Professor Kennedy and I disagree is first on the descriptive fact of whether that's what diversity statements are currently doing, or secondarily, or as a kind of fallback position, on the question of whether that's what they need to be doing or whether it could be otherwise. So one, empirical, is it otherwise? Two, even if not, could it be otherwise? Or the question is, could it be reformed in a way that would avoid Professor Kennedy's worries, his very justifiable worries? Or is it so hopeless, as he's argued, that it needs to be abandoned immediately? I think unlike a lot of people that talk in this space, I've spent quite a bit of time reading diversity statements and actually using them in appointments processes. So I've chaired and been on committees in which they've been required. And then at my school, every 3 years, the law faculty go up for some sort of advancement or raise, and we all vote on each other's raise, which means seeing each other's materials at that point, which explains what they've written, what they've taught, what service they've done, and how in all three of those areas, they've advanced the university's mission in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so having read just, a dozen of these a year with my colleagues and hundreds of them in the searches, I just don't think that they are doing the kind of thing that critics fear that they're doing or conceptualize them from outside as doing. So a very quick history of how we started using them at the University of California. Almost 20 years ago now, 2004, 2005, the then president had a commission to see what the status was of diversity within the 10 campus system. The faculty in those years ended up creating what is our institutional statement about diversity that was passed by the University Faculty Senate and then was adopted by our regents. And interestingly, our diversity statement first says that diversity should be integral to the university's achievement of excellence. And then in a complicated way has two different definitions of what we're talking about when we talk about diversity. So the first is quite inclusive. It refers to the variety of personal experiences, values, and worldviews that arise from differences of culture and circumstance. This could include race, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, language, abilities, disabilities, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, geographic region, and many more. So a hugely expansive conception of diversity there in paragraph 1. Interestingly, then in the final paragraph of the statement, and this is easily found online, Regents Policy 4400, if anybody is interested, the statement ends, the university particularly acknowledges the acute need to remove barriers to the recruitment, retention, and advancement of talented students, faculty, and staff from historically excluded populations who are currently underrepresented. So two different types of goals with diversity there. And keeping that in mind as going to the first of your points, John, about what kind of goal or mission might we see as having for the university? That was something that through shared governance was established at the University of California, again, about 20 years ago. Well, what followed from that were changes to what's called our academic personnel manual, again, system-wide, where we define what counts as academic merit in the system. What are we looking for when we hire, when we tenure, when we promote? And there they said, well, if this is part of the mission of the university, we shouldn't hide the ball. We should say that this is something that we are recognizing as a component of academic merit for our faculty. And so this is something that we should be evaluating in hiring, in tenure. And if we're going to do that, if it's going to be something that we value, these contributions, then we need to be asking people what their contributions are, which is to say, I think we should be asking people what they have done, or for faculty applicants, what they plan to do in order to advance this part of the university's mission. Complicated it as it is by the fact that we've defined that part of the mission in, perhaps not fully consistent ways, at least in two different ways. And that's where, starting in 2009, I believe, the first campus started experimenting with diversity statements. And then they really expanded the use in around 2017, 2018, to the point that now they're used throughout the system, both in hiring and in advancement. One last bit of that history. When I was chairing the Academic Freedom Committee, in response to worries that we are hearing, like Professor Kennedy's, we changed the recommendations that had originally been made without the input of the Academic Freedom Committee, unfortunately. We got involved and changed the system-wide recommendations. This is coming from the faculty, not from the administration, that say, first, DEI statements should focus not on beliefs, but on actions and plans. That was crucially important to us in order to avoid the Pledge of Allegiance type of concern. Don't ask for or seek pledges of allegiance, one way of saying that. And the other is going directly to Professor Kennedy's worry about being imposed from on high. It's that what is asked and sought in terms of diversity statements, and then the kind of rubrics used for evaluating them, need to be developed just like every other part of faculty evaluation, bottom up by the appointments committee or the tenure committee in each individual department that's doing the hiring or promotion. They're the ones who know what the kinds of DEI gaps or challenges or needs are within their field. And so ideally what they're doing with these statements is identifying what the challenges are, which are going to be different field to field, and then, rewarding people who are meeting those challenges, who have had actions or plans that are creatively addressing those shortcomings. So that's the goal, as I think I can say, as we see it within the University of California, both in terms of the mission and then how we can best advance that aspect of the mission.
Thanks. Thank you. Professor Kennedy, are there questions you'd like to ask?
Yes, I have a couple of reactions, and I do have a question. First, we were just presented with a portrayal that in many respects is attractive. The problem is, I think it's a wholly unrealistic portrayal. I don't believe it. You talk about one thing, on the question of imposition, you talk about, well, this was created by the faculty. Okay, let's suppose something's created by the faculty. What I'm concerned about is an individual scholar. So let's suppose that I go to your institution and you tell me that the faculty has produced something. Fine, I like that better than it being produced by non-academic bureaucrats. But even when it is produced by a group of the faculty, that I have my view, and just suppose my view does not align with a group of faculty, or the majority of faculty? What are we going to do about the people who, have views that are counter to what you present as the DEI goal? Here's my question to you, Brian. Do you imagine somebody who, in response to the requirement for a DEI statement, says, I'm a physicist, I'm a chemist, or I'm a historian, or I'm an anthropologist, whatever, and I don't believe that the DEI enterprise is a good enterprise. I think it was a mistake to create these bureaucracies. So you're asking for my orientation. I think it was a mistake. Do you really think that, what is the fate? What do you think will be the fate of that person? That's one, a related one. Imagine the person who says, I'm an old-fashioned liberal. I'm an old-fashioned liberal. I know that other people have different views than me, but frankly, I think that everybody should be viewed regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation. I know that there are a lot of people who don't, who think that that's an unrealistic view, but that's my view. My question to you, Brian, is in your experience across various institutions, what will be the fate of a scholar who says what I just posited?
Great.
Thank you. Brian, please.
I think in both cases, the two scholars you just posited didn't answer the question that I asked in requesting the diversity statement, because in both of the examples that you just gave, they have stated beliefs. I don't want beliefs. I want a statement of what you have done to advance this part of the university's mission. Now, if you think that, if you're the classic liberal who has a particular conception of what type of methods are going to advance that part of our mission, then you would be stating those things that you've done. And just like any other part of the application, there's going to be, your peers, your fellow disciplinary experts that are either going to recognize in what you say or not recognize in what you say, an accurate portrayal of what your field needs in this regard and what's effective in meeting that. And those will differ between the physics department and the law school and the drama school. Those are going to be different types of needs in terms of, in my old field as a philosopher of art, I would say most of our needs were around the kinds of examples we were using and the kinds of people we were reading and assigning. Everybody, when I was in grad school, had sort of two examples that they would do all their work on. It was Beethoven and Duchamp. Now we have a very rich field full of lots of micro communities of aesthetic experience. And it's a much richer and more diverse and really more successful field as a result. That's what we needed there. And lots of people were doing the work of trying to help people revise their syllabus, that kind of thing. That's an example of identifying a need and finding ways to help people meet it. I think in other fields, it's going to be less about the examples or the topics. It's going to be more about who's there, that there are gender gaps or things like that in particular fields where more mentorship and those kinds of activities are needed. But in neither of those cases are we asking you, what do you think of the DEI apparatus, for example? What I want to make sure, and this I hope goes directly to your question and concern, Professor Kennedy, is that I want to make sure that by asking about actions, we're leaving open space outside of the diversity statements for people to be just as vigorous as you are in other contexts, like in the faculty meetings, in the academic senate, in op-eds that they publish, just as vigorous as you are in contesting the effectiveness of certain DEI strategies, or even the value of diversity as it plays into the mission itself. I want to leave that space. I think it's crucially important.
Brian, I think that you, can I just say,
Please.
if I didn't it may very well be that I did not respond to your presentation of what you were asking. If that is so, that's because in preparation for this, I went online and read what institutions are asking for. My sense is that what you are asking for is rather idiosyncratic, and that my portrayal of what is actually being asked for is more characteristic. They are asking for, so at my home institution, I went online, what are they asking for? They weren't asking for, they were asking for, what's your orientation towards such and such a thing? What do you think about such and such a thing? How will you build into your scholarship and your teaching ideas that further DEI? I mean, further it, where's the room for somebody who says, I don't want to further it? Now, again, I want to be clear about this. What strikes me about this is, I mean, ideologically, I'm in the same tent with many of the people who are in favor of the DEI enterprise. And what I've got to say is, if I'm so exercised about this, if I feel like if I was seeking a position and I was asked some of these questions, I would feel indignant. I would feel, no, I think that this is illegitimate for you to ask me that question. If I am feeling this, well, good grief, I would imagine that people, to the right of me, people who, actually don't like the DEI enterprise at all, I imagine what they are feeling. And it seems to me, as scholars, we need to be attentive to such people. Don't we want to make our enterprise welcoming, actually, to all people who want to advance the pedagogical enterprise? Well, seems to me that that's what we should be asking.
But I think that's the question, because I can understand what you just say in a couple different ways. If the enterprise is something like, I, as a public university professor, think that I have a responsibility to make sure that I am teaching in a way such that a diverse set of students are flourishing at my school. That I want a set of students that is as diverse as California to be able to flourish at UC Davis. And I want UC Davis to be producing research that addresses the need of the full diversity of a state like California, the needs of that entire community. That if that's the enterprise, then I am going to, plant my flag and say, no, I think that somebody who's a professor at my school, that's the enterprise that I think we are engaged in. Now, there's lots of ways to advance that enterprise so described. I think there are, and then also to judge whether somebody has advanced it. I think what you're describing in terms of what you found online, if that's what's being asked, then that is a hugely counterproductive way of trying to advance it. I completely agree, but I said that at the beginning. We are on the same side there. I don't think that asking people about what concrete things are you doing to advance that enterprise as I just defined it? What is the gap? Well, we've got an inclusion gap at my school because textbook costs are so high. Costs in general are so high. All but one of my classes, I've created my own textbook. I put that in every diversity statement that I write every 3 years, because that is a way of advancing our mission towards inclusion. And so it's, it does come down to what people are asking. I've spent a lot of time in the last few years trying to evangelize on the side of asking, having bottom-up judgments, bottom-up prompts, and asking for actions and plans rather than beliefs. I was successful at changing the recommendations at the University of California. It's a huge system. Does that mean that every search we're doing is asking for them in the way that I would do if I were, the philosopher king of the place? Well, no. But that's where I think we differ in terms of, is the answer to that then cut it off, kill it immediately, or is the answer to work to make it productive?
Do
And
you
I
think you've
I
gotten a
think
lot out of these things?
with that,
Do you think that you said, you've read through these.
oh sure.
Do you have in your experience, do you think having read through these that in terms of selecting people, you are getting better teachers, better researchers on account of these mandatory diversity statements?
Yeah, I think they're beneficial in two ways. One is, yes, I actually do, and I can describe more fully why. But also, if people are doing it the right way, if what the project is, hey, we as a committee or we as a department are going to think about what the gaps are in our field, the challenges, that itself is a hugely productive enterprise. That somebody isn't just, making their syllabus in you're just out of inertia. They're not just teaching the same readings every year because they've always done it that way. They're actually thinking about whether there are ways that they could change their teaching, change their mentorship practices in order to be more successful at advancing this part of the mission. So I think that's a good thing. But I would just love to point people, I think better than I've ever said any of this, there was a essay in Inside Higher Ed last week by a professor, Suzanne Penwell, who is at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. And the title is Why I'm a Convert to Diversity Statements. And she had just chaired a appointments committee, was very much against them, less for the reasons that we've talked about here, and more just thinking that it was extra work for completely overburdened job applicants. Why make another statement? She didn't think it was going to be productive. And she totally changed her mind in the course of it. I just highly recommend this to people listening. She said that compared to the other statements they get, like teaching statements, these were actually less generic. It was the teaching statements where people were just saying generic things like, oh, I'm going to flip the classroom, student-centered pedagogy, et cetera. Where she said the DEI statements, in contrast, weren't predictable. Like me, one candidate said he made sure the textbook was free. Another mentioned online office hours for students who couldn't be on campus. Some had widened the range of perspectives in their reading, flexible attendance policies, things like this. They were generally modest in their aims, she said. And in fact, the people that did come across as ideologues on either side, that was a way that they thought, this is not the kind of person that we actually want. So somebody that just came in and said something about, usual kind of, what I think is often the sense of what's going on here, that you want somebody to come in and pledge fealty to Ibram Kendi or something like this. She said, people like that, we weren't looking for ideologues. For one thing, they're a pain in the ass at faculty meetings. That she thought that she was getting more specifics out of this part of the application than any other. So again, I just commend the essay to the audience here. I saw my experience reflected in that, but she just put it much better than I ever had.
Brian, can I ask you to respond to a point that Randall made early in his opening remarks about resentment?
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons I see this as well, having served on faculty committees with DEI up and running, that the resentment is quite real. And I think the resentment is focused on something like a concern that these requirements and the way they're implemented and the way the forms are evaluated, their intention with academic freedom, specifically with something like academic self-governance. Can you say anything about that? How do you see the relationship of these statements being required to academic freedom and academic self-governance?
Good. Well, so there's just the descriptive fact that some places that's not true, and I think that's my experience. But I want to take more
Sorry,
serious.
just to be clear on that point. So you're saying that in some places it actually is purely academic communities, that is departments, that decide whether or not to have the statements, and they also evaluate them with no other party involved, no bureaucratic party involved?
That's correct, but also sometimes the the administrative involvement is rather thin in the sense that they mandate that the statements be requested, but if there's I call it thin in that they are not in any way dictating either how they're asked for, what's being asked for, or certainly how the committee is evaluating them. What kind of rubric they're using. There was a brief suggestion at my campus in 2019 that we were told from the provost office to use rubrics supplied by that office, and there was immediate outcry from the faculty, and that was withdrawn within a month. And so, I don't mean to be Pollyanna-ish about it. Like there is a lot of places where there's not that kind of shared governance, and that's a real concern. But even that, I don't think gets to Professor Kennedy's deep, deep worry about resentment. And I spent a lot of time now thinking about, if we could get past the pledges of allegiance type worries by, as I would put it, doing it the right way, there is still going to be this resentment in part because of a lack of understanding of what's going on, in part because of an incredibly well-funded, well-coordinated campaign to, as has been clear, make the letters DEI, quote, toxic within American discourse, that this is to stand for everything that people hate about academia, if not race relations. That has been a coordinated effort nationwide, on the part of people like.
Let me ask you, Professor Kennedy, when you spoke about the resentment, was that connected to the questions of academic freedom and self-governance, that professors feel that they have some responsibility and right to make decisions about hiring without administrators being directly involved? What did you mean by resentment?
I simply meant that people are angry that and that they're being asked questions that they feel are encroaching upon areas that ought not be encroached upon. And I'm talking about people from a wide array of ideological positions. I'm talking about people, I'm talking about strong liberals. I'm talking about people on the left. I think that there is a very widespread belief that the mandated DEI statement was a tremendous mistake. But, sometimes when mistakes, get a certain amount of momentum, they get going. This is something, frankly, until a couple of years ago, I didn't even know about these DEI statements. I was amazed when I learned how pervasive they were. I didn't know where they came from. They have, they've grown up, where they come from, who was there study of them? Who actually designs them? How are they evaluated? Now, Brian tells us that, don't worry, let's just do it in the right way. Well, frankly, really, if Brian was in charge of it all in the United States of America, where there are 300 million people, if Brian was doing it, if Brian was doing it on his own, frankly, I would still not like it. I would still not like it, but I wouldn't be as concerned.
That was close.
Brian,
that was close, Brian.
But hold it, Brian, you are not doing it
that.
on your own. We had a debate a couple of months ago in which you acknowledged that in the California system, there had been earlier iterations of the mandated diversity statements, which you said, and I think you said earlier here, were mistaken, that they were encroachments on academic freedom, that they, they were counterproductive. Well, if that was so, and then you say, well, but we revised them. Okay, they've been revised, fine. Are you going to tell me that people oughtn't be worried in jurisdictions that maybe don't have people like you know, attending to things? Let me put it like this, Brian. Is there a legitimate reason for me to be worried? And if the answer is yes, then my position is, well, why not let's have as a prophylactic matter, why not let's get rid of my worry by not having these things?
Yeah.
Brian,
You have legitimate reasons to be worried. I think that you have far exponentially more reasons to be worried about other elements of the application and tenure and promotion file, most specifically the use of student teaching evaluations, which we don't have to rely on anecdote. We know from study after peer-reviewed study that they have racially and gender disparate impacts based just on appearance, that they have zero correlation with teaching effectiveness, that they're a primary driver of grade inflation, that they cause teachers to censor what they say and change what they do in class in ways that they don't find to have any pedagogical support. We know that they're imposed by administrators and that they outsource academic judgments to non-experts, by definition, students. We know all of that, and yet over 96% of the schools in this country rely on student teaching evaluations, far outpacing any current use of diversity statements. So I'm not trying to change the subject here. I'm just saying we've got some academic freedom concerns when it comes to the ways that we evaluate each other in academia. I don't mean to deny that by any means, but if you're worried about just the fact that there's a whole bunch of faculty and not all of them might be doing this with academic freedom, in mind in the way that I at least hope I'm doing it, that's nothing compared to the sort of outsourcing we're doing of academic merit judgments to students, for example. So am I worried? Yeah, but there's lots of worries. There's when the University of California started experimenting with changing the order in which we read applications. So there was a year in which, in just a few special searches, 8 at my campus, about the same number at Berkeley, we started by reading only the diversity statements anonymized for those 8 searches. And then once those were judged, then the provost's office would release the rest of the file, and we'd go from there.
Just to be clear for our listeners, this is an experiment where the diversity statements were taken to be the first cut before they could look at degree granting institution, letters of recommendation, publications. The first cut.
Exactly. All you saw was an anonymous diversity statement.
And tell us about the findings from that.
Well, one, we didn't do it that way again in the future because they were so deeply interrelated with other parts. So now, to the extent anybody does that for broader searches, it's been the diversity statement paired with the research statement, but again, anonymized, and then opening up. And, lots of criticism for that, to be sure. Lots of allegations that it's a litmus test or something like that. But, you just have to keep in mind that although that's not the right way to do it, I don't think. I think that's what we discovered, that just doing the diversity statement first did not give us the kind of full information we needed, even for that initial pass. But there's always an initial pass. Randall and I as law professors, get a stack of entry applications. It all comes in one book with 1 page per applicant, 400 people or something in a given year. And there's always a first pass, and it's names. You learn a lot from a name. It's degree granting institution. It's name of recommenders. And, I can guarantee you that at both of our institutions, a large number of those applications just get, cut at that pass before, certainly before anybody has read a single word of research of scholarship that any candidate has written. So there's always something that provides.
Brian, if I just jump in here, I mean, most academics would say that in sorting through the stacks, people use degree granting institution as a proxy for merit and ability. Mm-hmm. There's other proxies for merit and ability that they're using rather than setting every file de novo. That seems quite different than asking for a diversity statement as a first cut.
Well,
but
only if you assume that diversity statements have nothing to do with academic merit.
that's
I
exactly
find
it.
that, yeah, I find that to be question begging.
Can Brian, what do you make, again, just going online and, we got, people can just go online, put in a DEI statement, and immediately there are hundreds of sites for people, there's a cottage industry of people producing these things, making suggestions of these things. Is that suggestive of something? I mean, I think that one of the things that's one of the problems I have is isn't this an invitation for insincerity? Um, People know what folks want to hear. You make it seem as though, well, we're innocently asking a question. No, you're not, and we're speaking at a moment in which higher education is really in the crosshairs coming from various directions with respect to academic freedom. We have a committee in Congress that says that it's just asking questions. No, they're not just asking questions. They've come to conclusions. They know what they want to hear. And if they don't hear, if you don't up with what they want to hear, off with your head. Same thing here. Don't, it's true that we were told in the beginning, try to be generous with the other side. And I'm down with that to some extent. On the other hand, there is such a thing as being naive. And when institutions are saying, we want to hear from you about certain things, you would be foolish not to know what they want to hear. And you can either do two things. You can refuse to play ball and be sincere and not get the job, or you can be insincere. Play ball. I know what these people want. I'm going to give them the boilerplate. My sense from talking with people is that there is lots of boilerplate, which leads me to yet maybe my final thing, which is, I think, Brian, that you and I probably have a very different conception of what's really going on here. I do not think that what's really going on here is a matter of pedagogy. I don't. I think it is structured that way. It is defended that way. But in my view, what's going on here is a type of symbolic cultural politics in which a group has gotten a certain amount of power and wants to push its power and wants to make people acknowledge its power. It seems to me that that is what is going on here. This is yet another front in, culture war. And the matter of pedagogy, in my view, is largely pretextual. Maybe that's an overly cynical view, but that is the view that I have.
Thank you. And
I
we can
understand.
excuse me, we can question motives in both directions. And Brian, I'm going to give you a chance to say more in a moment. I just want to go to a question from our audience. One question is that is actually directly to you, Brian. Brian, in the diversity statements you have read, how often have the candidates discussed contributions related to religious diversity, national origin diversity, geographical diversity, or political diversity, as opposed to racial, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, or sexual orientation diversity? Can you say something about that?
Yeah. The certainly geographic diversity, urban, rural, that kind of thing is something that comes up regularly. Some religious diversity, some certainly a lot to do with first gen students. And that's an interesting example, I think, because I have a colleague at the law school who first started talking about the work she was doing with first gen students, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, something that was deeply important to her. And it was basically rejected. She was told by her tenure committee or whatever, you know, that's not what people are asking for. That's not what we care about here. And she has really spent much of her career using her work to show why that was important, to the point that now we have a whole advising program that's first gen sponsored, and Central Campus is putting it on their website, all of that. So, I think like any other area of the application, that's something that you make the case for, just like your scholarship, such that outlier scholarship becomes central within a field, it becomes, grows acceptance because it's just shown to work. So is there more of a focus on race, gender, sexual orientation? Yeah, I think that's true. I think in a lot of fields, if you're identifying the gaps, that's often where they are.
Let me,
I
let
just
me,
have to say, I just have to say, and it's one sentence, that I care about the insincerity boilerplate plate concerns that Professor Kennedy has. I just don't see how they're related to requests for actions rather than beliefs.
well, good. That the next question actually is directly on that point, and I'll present it to you, Professor Kennedy, if you want to take the first crack on it. This question says, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, that Brian, it seems as though you were saying that the initial wave of these statement requirements focused on beliefs, or at least they looked like they focused on beliefs, whereas the new generation focuses on not so much on beliefs, candidates' beliefs, but on actions and plans. And there's two things there, right? There's actions, things you've done, I gather, and then things that you intend to do. And the question is, to either of you, do you think these statements pass legal muster? Is that movement from beliefs to actions and plans the key attempt to make it legally acceptable? Is that where the action is legally? That's for you, Randall, if you like, or you, Brian, if you like.
Brian, go ahead.
Hmm. Uh, I don't know that the legal question turns on it. I think there are, when you said earlier, John, that we can't ask about, or we can't make academic judgments, hiring decisions based on political beliefs, or shouldn't. Uh, that needs a little bit of an asterisk, right? We certainly can't say, tell us what your party affiliation is, and that should have nothing to do with, with hiring. But when it comes, and if in the chemistry department, we would never ask somebody what their view on immigration policy should be. But that's a kind of topic that might come up when we're hiring a new director for our asylum clinic at the law school, right? So there is a way in which certain types of political views become relevant to certain views that could be called political, become relevant to certain jobs, but not others. And viewpoint discrimination varies based on, I think, is better understood as relevancy to the position. So what we call viewpoint discrimination is really irrelevant viewpoint discrimination. That's the legal thing. But I think the change was more to address and acknowledge the kinds of worries that Randall and many others have rightly raised, which is, why do you want people just to why would you ever want somebody to pledge allegiance? Why would you ever want to just spout some sort of creed that they may or may not actually believe in? What value do you possibly get out of that if AI could just generate a diversity statement for you? It can't generate it if we're asking about plans. I see no value in asking people just to say something like those yard signs, in this house we believe women's rights are human rights, and all, and Black Lives Matter and blah, blah. Like, nobody wants that. That does nothing for a hiring committee and would just be very useless.
In my comments, there, first of all, there is litigation that has already begun with respect to this issue. I'm sure there will be more litigation, but frankly, I didn't want to get into the legal issue, because for me, more important than the legal issue is what's good for university life. So I would take the same position that I'm taking, even if the court said you can do it. Let's assume that there is nothing illegal about mandatory diversity statements. My issue is that a good way for us to run institutions of higher education? And even if it is legal, I have my doubts, but even if it is legal, it's not good. And it's not good because when people enter this realm realistically, not nominally, not just what is said after it's been gone over 1,000 times to make it look nice and innocent and inoffensive, what's really going on. I think what's really going on in lots of places is an effort to make people genuflect or to weed certain people out. I think that in some places the idea is, gosh, this person knows they're supposed to say certain things, and if they don't say certain things, we know they're going to be a pain if we let them in. So let's keep them out. This is a good signal. This is a good way for us to weed out people who are not going to play ball. Well, my view is that's not a good way to run an institution of higher learning. We've seen this before. What would we say? Let me close. What would we say if the question was, what are your plans? What have you done to advance the goals of making America great again? What would we say then? What would we say if, what have you done? And what do you plan to do? We're not talking about beliefs here. What have you done? What do you plan to do to inculcate or to advance patriotism? Would that be okay?
I thought we had begun by agreeing. I thought we started with a place of agreement that efforts to promote a greater inclusion at institutions in which there hasn't historically been certain forms of inclusion was a valuable goal and aim of the university. Did I misunderstand that?
Let's assume that's correct.
Okay, so I take it then that
Patriotism is it? You have American institutions. I can imagine many public institutions, public and private institutions. The American flag flies outside. The American flag flies outside of, the administrative buildings.
And there, I can imagine a service academy. I can imagine any particular type of institution that would ask for that and that would care about that. That's not how our university has defined its mission. That's not how your university has defined its mission. So I thought we were starting on a common ground of, let's say that both of us think that inclusion, greater inclusion, is a valid and admirable aim for our university to advance. If so, then we need ways of advancing it. And if so, if that's something that we take as a valuable activity for our faculty and staff and students to be advancing, then for our faculty, we should be rewarding work that helps us achieve that aim. And to reward it, you have to ask about it. And I am very open, in order to get past some of the resentment that you're rightly identifying, if there are better ways to ask those questions, to find out
why is it mandatory? Why is it mandatory, given what you just said? Why isn't it the case that people just, as a matter of course, this is an attractive feature to my profile, as a matter of course, I will give you this information. Why is it mandated?
I see zero difference between a mandatory statement in which you say, 0 DEI contributions this term versus an optional statement in which there's just no contributions, in which you don't give any kind of statement at all. I don't see a difference there in the same way that I always have to submit a teaching statement, an account of my teaching, even on semesters like this one where I'm on sabbatical and don't teach at all. It's just, sort of zero teaching contributions this term. It's still mandatory, but I don't see any difference turning on that part. That's not where I see
It's 5 o'clock, and I need to keep a promise to our visitors. I do want to note, Brian, that there's a comment that went by the chat. I just saw that someone was asking whether the UC Davis flies the American flag or not. I'm not sure how relevant that is, but I just want to throw that out there for your for your enjoyment. So I just want to thank you both very much, Professor Kennedy, Professor Soucek, for joining us for this conversation. I also want to just thank all the guests for listening in. You can find more about our speakers on the links posted in the chat. Also, just a final reminder for many of you who are listening that HXA is having its annual conference this summer in June in Chicago. You can find out about HXA's conference on our website. Again, please join HXA if you're a member, or if you'd like to become a member, please join HXA. And I'll just close again by thanking Professor Kennedy and Brian Soucek for a lovely conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Randall.
Bye-bye. Thank you.